Okay, it's time to start today's session. So our session's title is the G2 War, Fight for Economic Hegemony. So as you know, nowadays we have the big issues about China and the US. So those countries are in some sense they are competing and coordinating nowadays. And also we have the big issue of Chinese currency internationalization. So some people say Chinese currency is challenging for the role of US dollars. And also nowadays we are observing some slowdown of Chinese economy. So we have so many big issues in terms of the G2, US and China. Especially we have the very honored honored speakers. First speaker is Eswar Prasad from Cornell University. Eswar Prasad is the senior professor of trade policy at Cornell University. He is also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and research associate at the MBER. And he was previously chief of the Financial Studies Division in the International Monetary Funds and Research Department. And before that, he was also the head of IMF China Division and other division. And also his book, which is very famous, The Dollar Trap, was selected as one of the best economics books of the 2014 by the Financial Times, the Eswar Prasad. Prasad will give some very brief introduction or your idea on this issue. Okay.
Thank you and good afternoon. It is always very dramatic to think about two great powers colliding against each other. And certainly China and the US are competing for space in many dimensions: economic, political, geopolitical. But I think the economic sphere is one where actually the notion of a war is probably one that has the least traction, because it is not necessarily a zero-sum game. But the complication here is that economic prerogatives get tied in with political and strategic objectives. And that, I think, has given a much sharper edge to this notion of economic dominance between the two countries. Now, if one looks at the numbers, certainly China is fast catching up to the US. On a purchasing power parity adjusted exchange rate basis, China is already slightly bigger than the US. But at market exchange rates, the US is about a $17 trillion economy. The US is about a $10.5 trillion economy. But at the margin, China, of course, has become the biggest contributor to global growth since the financial crisis. But when I think about how these two economies are dealing with each other, I like to think of one analogy. China, at one level, is a young child growing into an adolescent, still a little awkward and uncomfortable with its body, and still trying to figure out how to make its presence felt on the world stage. But as a parent of an adolescent child myself, I know that for the adult also, it's a process of adjustment, because when your child starts becoming a teenager and then a young adult, you have to get used to treating that little child as an adult. And there's a lot of adjustment on both sides. And that, I think, is what we are seeing play out in the China-US relationship. Now, China, to its credit, I think, has begun to become much more mature about its role in the world economy. There was a sense early on that China was using its economic power in order to broaden its strategic and political interests, and doing so in a way where there were very clear quid pro quo. So if China gave money to an African country, there was a sense that China wanted something in return. My view is that China has become much more savvy and disciplined in its international engagement. It's doing its international engagement much more through multilateral fora, including the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRICS Development Bank, the contingent reserve arrangement of the BRICS. So essentially what China is trying to do is, I think, two very important things which ultimately are going to make China a much bigger force to contend with in the world economy. rather than trying to go out and completely rewrite the rules, I think what China is doing is, number one, trying to set up institutions where not only is it meeting the governance standards set up by the existing multilateral institutions, but it is in fact trying to exceed them. And in many ways, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, I think, goes above and beyond what the existing institutions like the IMF and the World Bank have been able to achieve in terms of their governance structures. Second, I think through these moves, China is also catalyzing changes. It's essentially giving a kick in the backside to the existing institutions to get their act together. So I think China is now becoming a much more constructive player on the world economic stage, and the US at some level is going to have to get used to China's rising power. And from the US side as well, I think there is the notion that what China needs to do in terms of its own reforms are going to be good for the US itself. So rather than going to this notion of a war, I think the key issue with both economies are trying to contend with is, at least on the economic sphere, how can their interests be combined so that you get reforms that ultimately are going to help both countries. And sitting behind all of this, as the moderator mentioned, of course, is the big question about currencies. China's renminbi is certainly on its way to becoming a major international currency. My sense is that if China continues with its economic and financial market reforms, the renminbi is going to become a reserve currency. But I don't think the renminbi will ascend to the status of a safe haven currency. That is a currency that investors turn to for safety rather than diversification or yield, unless China is willing to undertake not just economic and financial reforms, but a much broader set of institutional and legal reforms. So my prediction is that the renminbi over the next decade to two is going to become a viable and perhaps significant reserve currency. It's going to erode but not seriously challenge the dollar's dominance. Thanks.
You have already mentioned the financial reform. Then do you have any mind on the priority of those institutional reforms? I mean, I guess if you suggest some risk factors which are very important in Chinese economy, then we might think of those institutional reforms to respond to those risk factors. So you can give some risk factors of the Chinese economy, or some priority of what reform, like the labor market reform, or the financial market reform, or the income inequality, or real estate bubble, or stock market issue, something like that. So what would be the most important?
So financial market reforms, which the government has been correctly prioritizing, I think are going to be crucial for China to have more sustainable growth, to have better growth, because unless you have proper resource allocation within the economy so that you have credit going to the more dynamic parts of the economy, this economy is not going to function very well. But I think financial market reform, as I alluded to earlier, is moving forward, perhaps slowly, perhaps in a haphazard way. But as Professor He Liping pointed out, a number of things have been done. Deposit rate liberalization is not complete, but it's almost there. The intention to make the exchange rate more flexible certainly was displayed on August 11th, although it was not implemented in a very good fashion. The deposit insurance system is in place. So things are happening. What really worries me is that on the real side of the economy, not much is happening. Professor He alluded to the plan that came out a couple of weeks ago about state enterprise reform. I think it's not a forceful enough program in terms of how much needs to be done in dealing with the state enterprise reform. Plus, you need reform of the household registration system, liberalization of the services sector, and liberalization of parts of the economy where the state sector still has a monopoly. So I think these real side reforms are going to be absolutely crucial. In addition, again, as was alluded to, there can be a long laundry list of reforms one thinks about. A number of reforms are needed in terms of the taxation and expenditure structure, especially to increase the durability of the social safety net, because that affects household savings and overall saving levels in the economy, and prevents the rebalancing of the economy towards consumption and away from investment. So I think getting the real side of the economy reformed in a manner that keeps pace with the financial sector reforms is going to be crucial. But in addition, I think this institutional reform, which includes things that are necessary for a market-oriented system to work well, in addition to better corporate governance standards and so on, a legal framework that provides better protection of property rights, of contractual law, all of these are crucial building blocks for a market-oriented system to work well. So I think the objective of moving towards a more market-determined economy is the right one, and I see progress in the financial sector reforms, but quite frankly, not anywhere else.
Already mentioned that issue. So it's time to wrap up our discussion. Let us have some questions from the floor and some answers. So please raise your hands if you have any questions, and then you can specify who want to answer to your questions.
So while listening to the discussions of the three speakers, the reform that China needs to take right now is mainly structural reform, as Dr. Prasad also mentioned and other professors also mentioned. But also in the morning, I listened to a session about the demographic cliff and also how China is facing great possible bubble burst from its too fast growth and bubbles and estate bubbles. So, and reforms, although they are in need, they are easier said than done. So, but I would like more specific examples or more in-depth descriptions of how pragmatic reforms could actually be implemented to China in short-term future. Thank you.
That's a good and very complex question, because China is an economy that is becoming more market-oriented, that is becoming much larger and complex, and the very process of reforms creates its own risks. It's what we economists call the second-best world. If you have a lot of distortions in an economy and you remove one distortion, you could actually potentially make things a little worse, as we've seen with financial market liberalization. So over time, I've come to appreciate the Chinese approach to reforms, because in the past, I myself have written that China needs much bolder and bigger reforms, but given how fragile this economy is, it's hard to imagine that you could undertake very large reforms without creating significant risk. But I think the reality that the Chinese government faces right now is that many of these reforms are tied together. What is crucial to deal with many of the issues you pointed out, that China's growth is slowing down, and with the demographic factors working against China, that's going to be another headwind. What is going to be crucial for China is, number one, better resource allocation. So for instance, when you have financing going through the banking or other parts of the financial system, that it goes not to the state-owned enterprises that have not been very profitable. There are some that are very profitable, but not to the others, but goes to the more dynamic parts of the economy, the small and medium enterprises, the services sector, which can generate much better job growth and better output growth. And the second issue is how to raise productivity. Now, China, despite its demographic headwinds, can still, I think, generate a good bit of growth just by reallocating labor from the less productive parts of the economy to the more productive parts. And I think the Chinese government's urbanization strategy can be seen as one manifestation of that approach. But there is going to be the need to think about how to increase productivity in the manufacturing sector, but also in the services sector. The Chinese government has already talked about upgrading its manufacturing processes, moving up the value-added chain, and they do seem to have a strategy for that, both for the domestic economy, but also for the exporting sector. So I think these are good frameworks to think about what China needs to do. And we could spend the rest of the evening talking about specific reforms, but I think this is the overall lay of the land.
Okay, it's time for us to wrap up this session. So I'm very honored to have insightful speakers and also a good question from the floor and really good answers to that question. So please give a round of the applause to all the excellent speakers. Thank you.
The World Knowledge Forum